Hello, now I'm going to talk about the patterns about metadata patterns, mapping patterns. And the main idea here is that you want to define the relation between the structures in the domain side and the structures in the database. And a way to decouple these two structures is to have some metadata that basically says that a class corresponds to this table. And then you can have code generation techniques or introspection, reflection techniques that basically put them together. But the advantage of this is that by changing this metadata, you basically can change the mapping. So you don't need to write again the code basically. Of course, this provides a generic way to deal with changes either in the domain or in the structure of the domain or the structure of the database. You may look at some of these metadata, for instance, when you use GPA, when you have all these annotations that actually are defining mappings between the names in the class and the names in the database. Of course, even if you don't put the annotations there, they define some metadata by convention in the sense of how a name of a class maps to a name of a database table. But the advantage of this is as soon as you have this metadata is that you can start writing more code here that is agnostic about the mapping and the structures on the other side. So the three patterns that are described is metadata mapping, query object, and repository. I'm gonna just go a very quick walk through them before you read the documentation, okay? So the first one is metadata mapping. And so the idea is you should have a structure where you store information about, for instance, the relation between the name, the domain class and the table name, and the column name and the field name. Actually, look, this information is collected from your code, in your case in GPA, by reading the entity classes and the information you have there about the tables. So, but what is the advantage of having these in terms of metadata is that then you can have very generic code that reads these information and generates or interprets these in order to provide all the mappings, in order to support part of what is around here. Okay. And of course now, and as you read it, you read it about the advantages of code generation or reflection when you do this. Okay. And this is not different from what we have already talked about, some of reuse techniques, object-oriented frameworks. For instance, when I explain you how JUnit is implemented, all these patterns. For instance, when you read a method to discover how do you identify a method that actually is a test case. Okay, so it's a similar technique. It's a technique that you apply in software engineering quite often using this metadata information. So, and it's another level of independence that even decouples more all these structures. Actually, all object-oriented mappers like GPA are based on metadata, so that they can be really customizable for each client, for each application that applies them. Okay. So the other one is query object, and the idea of query object is to have queries written in a way that is completely independent of the structure of the database. So you create criteria, and this is independent of the structure of the database. So again, what we are talking about is basically you have your queries here writing in an object-oriented way, and in a way that basically can ignore the structure of the database, which means that you need some metadata then from these. Okay, you have a query, you have two criteria, then you may have an AND or an OR operator to relate the criteria, but the point here is that basically you need to generate code afterwards or interpret this so that you have the real query. What is the advantage of having the query object? We'll read about it, but basically, again, independence. So you have an independence layer. Another thing is that probably the query objects can be intelligent in a way that if the information is already exists, so they do not duplicate code, for instance. Okay, so if you have several queries, they just if you try to write the query directly, probably you repeat code, and then you do not repeat the code. Okay. And the last one is repository. And the idea of repository is related with the query idea, is that you manage in-memory objects together, so you have them together, and so that you submit the queries to the repository, and the repository basically see if the queries the objects already exist, and manage this. So it's strongly related with the query, the query option, the query pattern as well, the query object pattern. Okay, I think that's basic this. Okay, so all three patterns basically rely on metadata about the information. So, and then can provide higher levels of independence. Okay, enjoy.